The debut episode this season is one that I know you guys had been bandying the idea around for a while and had been wanting to do it, and I'd been obviously in favor of it. But I said last week on the show, I like the way that you did it because it's Chris Candido's story and Tammy is in it.
Mhm.
And because Tammy has been told and done and commented on, and the whole tragedy there mulled over. But in that time, Chris has gotten obviously overlooked in a lot of ways, in a lot of cases. And in this instance, this program, it's Chris's story and Tammy is in it. You couldn't tell it without her, but
Right.
it focuses on a lot of Chris's friends and his family, his brother Johnny,
Mhm.
his mother. So, when you guys started out shooting the footage,
Mhm.
did you have it in your mind it was going to turn out this way, or is that the way it evolved?
Well, to take like a few steps back, we had always wanted to do this story ever since I think the first season. It had always been on our radar as a story to do. We had actually corresponded with Tammy, during her various legal situations over the years. Like, when she'd be, in jail, and we wrote letters and got them into her, and she wrote us back letters, trying to put the episode together all the way back then, and it never quite lined up. Where we were in production, and she was able to do the interview and stuff like that. So when it finally got around to this season, we were just like, okay, no matter what, regardless, given Tammy's present legal situation, we were just like, we're gonna go ahead with this. And then the idea was we're gonna still try to get her in the episode, which we did. We actually were corresponding with some of the folks on her legal team in order to see if we could get permission for an interview.
How big is her
Ultimately,
legal team? How
well,
numerous is her legal team? Is
well,
Cochran in
she
there and
has
Darrow and
Well, she has I think, personal legal stuff, and she has the criminal side. So it's a team. It's a team. I think more than one is a team. And ultimately the criminal legal side decided that it would be, that it wouldn't be maybe in her best interest to do the interview, and heavily told her that she shouldn't do it, which I understand. With the trial coming up, you may not want to sway a jury one way or the other with something like this coming out. So so we had started filming the episode really with Chris's story in mind. And if we were able to get Tammy on camera, we would have pivoted to maybe something much larger, maybe a two-part episode, maybe something that really was both of their stories, combined into one. But we always were pretty much favoring the Chris Candido story and going to commit to that. And basically, we got word that Tammy wasn't able to do the episode pretty much at the last possible second, and then then we fully committed to Chris's story. And I am glad that we did. Chris Candido, I was a huge fan of his as a kid. I was a big ECW fan growing up and stuff like that. So um, it was really cool to, as you said, he is really kind of underappreciated. I think, if Chris Candido were around today, he would be a much bigger name. I think his style, kind of was forecasting the wrestling style of now. And I think his size, being a smaller, guy, is much more in style. So I think like he really was this really influential, amazing unsung talent. And I mean, his finishing move, the power bomb off the top rope, always blew my mind every time I saw it. I couldn't believe that was like the craziest finishing move I'd ever seen as a kid. So yeah, it was just really
and
cool to be able to tell the story.
let me say
Yeah,
this. Because I said, and I say in the episode, Chris, if he was around today, would be one of the bigger stars in the business.
yeah.
Um, and he would have had, trying to figure out how to say this, he would have had a better influence on the in-ring guys today if he was still around to be able to talk to them
Mhm.
and teach them things that he had learned rather than them imitating him. Because it's much like, even though Mick Foley still, people imitated the dangerous part of Mick Foley without having the talent and the mental
Mhm.
grasp of the business underneath. Chris was an old school wrestling fan who knew that he had to do that stuff to get noticed and turn it into an art form, but he broke his body down at an early
Yeah.
age. But toward the end, he was starting to realize where he could have picked and chosen his spots and his things a little better. And he always had a mind and a love for the business to teach guys things that he had learned and to learn and blah, blah, blah. So
Hmm.
that's what I wish about Chris is that he's not around to tell guys, here's how I was doing it, here's why I was doing it. And in some cases, here's why you shouldn't do it. Because I figured that out too late. And he was that kind of guy that he could have done that.
Yeah, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember when we did the interview with you, you were telling us about his time in Smoky Mountain when he kind of first came in, that he was like going crazy, taking all these crazy bumps and falling out into the floor and the concrete and doing all these things that maybe weren't entirely necessary, but was just like his immediate instinct to try to, make a big
Well, yeah,
impression, right?
he was trying to get over it. He was doing all the crazy stuff he did on the Independence in New Jersey
Right.
when they didn't really know who he was. Just another guy. It was just guys doing moves. There was no TV. There was no defined, reason, logic, universe behind this. So he comes down there and the people are like, well, shit, that looks like it hurt him more than it hurt the other guy.
Right.
Because they were used to kind of shit that made more sense. And who is this guy? And once he figured out, get them into your personality, and then they will go crazy over shit you do.
Right. Right.
That was his. And then getting in the ring with the Rock and Roll Express or Mick Foley or the Armstrong family or any of the veterans, young and old, that he was able to work with. He learned so quick. And that's something else I was going to ask you is,
Mhm.
when you got the pictures of Chris when he was a teenager from his
Yeah.
mom and his brother, when he was already, running his own shows and making his own matches up and making his own
Yeah.
championship belts. That was some cool stuff that even I had
Yeah.
not seen. And it shows that he kind of had a mind not to just play wrestler, but to actually be wrestler from an
Mhm.
early age, going to the trouble because all the other guys get on a trampoline in their backyard. He found a fucking guy with a real ring running real shows and bullshitted his way on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's one thing that I think is really cool for viewers to see with this episode is just that, from a very young age, Chris made this decision. I mean, probably 5 years old, that like I was going to become a wrestler no matter what. And everything he did in life was to fulfill that dream. And I think you see it very clearly, when his brother is showing that upstairs attic with all these just old, drawings of Ric Flair and Roddy Piper and these old like handmade toy rings. And it's just like, it's amazing. Like, you can just tell that from, 5 years old, this kid loved wrestling and was going to be a huge part of his life forever. And then, as you said, like we kind of, because of the runtime constraint, we kind of gloss over it, but he really was putting on these local shows at a extremely young age of like 14, maybe even younger, where he was able to finagle a ring. Any of the wrestlers, like the like professional wrestlers who lived in the area, he would book them and get them on the shows. He would make all the belts, the merch, like the entrance, and they had music. So it was this real DIY sort of production he was doing. And then, of course, he was also wrestling in Brooklyn, taking the bus down there, lying to his parents that he was going to go sleep over at his friend's house. And then he'd basically take the bus into Brooklyn. And they do these shows when, he was 14 years old, wrestling other guys, somehow sneak on the show and, get color in these matches and stuff. And it's crazy. That's crazy. But I mean, I love it. I mean, he's just a diehard for the business,
But that's
and
what
that's what you see.
when I first met him, he was inquisitive, and you could tell he was sharp, and he was kind of with it, as
Yeah.
Frank Spaceman Hickey used to say about the wrestling business, because he'd been around at that point for a while. But one thing I wish that if Dennis Coralluzzo was still around, he would have been possibly
Yeah.
the star of this show,
Right.
because he had such a big part in pushing Chris on everybody that he knew because he believed in Chris and he was right.
Yeah.
And also what a character he was. But besides, Dennis not being able to be a part of the show, I thought Tom Pritchard obviously was close with Chris in Knoxville, and then later on the brief run as partners.
Yeah.
And Lance Storm had a lot of affection for Chris, and that's why I said last week on the show, you somehow in 45 minutes plus commercials managed to get Chris's brother Johnny, me, Tom Pritchard, and Lance Storm all to break down and cry and walk off camera over somebody.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is, did you find when you were doing this that everybody universally had almost nothing but praise for Chris? Did you, on the other side of the coin, have anybody even offer to say, "Oh, Tammy, you got her all wrong"? It ain't there anymore, is it?
Well, I think with respect to Chris, and just you can really tell in the episode how much, what a great guy he was, and like the connection that he had with everybody in the episode, including yourself. And I think also there's just a lot of empathy for Chris, because everybody knows the struggles he went through, and that this was how important the business was to him and all the sacrifices he made. But also I think everybody, was very, observed that relationship that he had with Tammy and knew what he was going through and what he probably had internalized for so long. And I think that's hard to look back at, however many years now. It's been almost 20 years. So that, I think it really shows just the effect that he had on his peers and how well beloved he was. I haven't really heard anything bad about Chris from anybody ever that we've talked to, even outside of the folks that are in the show. I think with Tammy, and I think you can attest to this too, it's like, because you had both of them, when they were kids, they're still teenagers or just out of high school going into college. And I can only imagine just how surreal it is when you see both of them so young, impressionable, innocent, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, coming into this business, and then knowing how it's all going to wind up, the roller coaster on the other side of where they're both going to wind up, and kind of being brought into this business, chewed up and spat out a little bit, and where it goes is just kind of almost unfathomable, something you probably could never have predicted, right?
The only thing I will modify of what you just said is Chris, to an extent, got some chewing and some spitting. Yeah. Tammy chewed her own arm off.
Okay.
She did a lot of her own chewing. So, and that's the thing is, I think now it's so sad that it would have been wonderful if there was one redemption out of this, that Tammy, after what happened with Chris, had suddenly managed to get herself together in some fashion to provide some positive end of the thing. But hers is worse, because he never hurt anybody else but himself. And I think that's why I said, and anybody who wants to know my full current feelings on Tammy, they're on the YouTube channel at length. You can look them up from when we heard about the accident in Florida. So I'm not going to go into that. Otherwise, then I was one of the holdouts for quite a while. I was like, well, maybe at some point she will, calm down and get it together, whatever, because I did feel bad, not only from seeing them when they were the fresh-faced teenagers, but also I was somewhat willing to make excuses for her for some period of time when she was only embarrassing herself because of, and I was also willing to make excuses for her when nobody else particularly liked her personally, because I like the talent. I could identify with somebody being a fucking aggravating fucking bitch or whatever, because I like the talent also. But at some point in time, she's lost any support she had from anybody, and it's, due to her own actions.
Yeah, I guess what I meant by that too was that was the time in wrestling, especially in the WWF, where it's like Soma Central, and I just obviously I wasn't there or anything, but the experience of hearing the stories, again, a runtime issue of if we had more time and what we could get into, is just the horror stories of the soma abuse in this relationship is quite scary, because for me it's like, a soma, a muscle relaxer, it has its purpose, but taken in excess, it basically is like turns you into a walking zombie, in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. And they both would be using these recreationally for days on end, in mass quantities, and there's a lot of near death experiences, a lot of car crashes, a lot of freakouts, and a lot of things that Johnny and other family members had to come in and try and save, and there were near overdose instances, and it's just this horror show. And I think, like, it's that thing where once you're introduced to it, via a locker room, a colleague, whatever, and when that one pill isn't enough, and then you got to take 6 for it to work, and then it's 12, and you have the schedule you have to keep up. You're on the road 300 days. You're putting your body through so much, especially him and ECW and all that stuff, and then it just catches up to you, and then it just becomes something. And probably in Chris's case, which I think Johnny does say too, is that it was not only just purely for the pain management, but also probably for the emotions of what he was going through too, because I think their relationship was emotionally fraught. There were a lot of pretty, dramatic, violent situations going on, and a lot of fights and scary stuff. And so I think, yeah, I think he was probably using it for that too. And yeah, it's an incredibly sad story. you know. Yeah.
All chemicals or elements have their useful purpose, but sometimes a couple of them just don't mix correctly,
Right.
and
Yeah.
things happen.